We knew that there would be something coming on the China front. We weren't quite sure what it was, and as I said before, we said it'll be June 21st, but things will change 21 times between now and then. I think that's what I told all our panelists. I said just be prepared on the day of. I can tell you right now, I've been monitoring my Twitter feed. There hasn't been anything in the last hour that I'm aware of. If something's popped in the last 5 minutes, I apologize. A special thanks to all of our guests from the first panel as well. For this panel, we're really delighted to have all of you here. Charles, it's a return engagement. Same with Derek, Bruce, Mary. Welcome for the first time to being on a WITA event. Thanks to all of you for joining us. With that, I'll turn it over to Charles.
Ken, thank you so much, and thanks to the WITA board. And real thrilled to be in a room of such experts. We actually have three even more expert panelists to talk about something. What we're going to do here is all give a full-throated roar of approval for the Trump administration's approach to China. So we're going to probably not. I was trying to figure out if we could find somebody that would stand up and say, here's why it all makes sense, and maybe someone would be able to do that. I'm Charles Friedman. I'm Senior VP for Asia at the Chamber. Our position, just so everybody's clear, is that it's kind of annoying, but we say we agree by and large with the diagnosis. We disagree with the prescription. And but the challenge, of course, is that the diagnosis. There are three general areas that people talk about when they complain about trade with China. There is the issue of the bilateral trade deficit. There is the question of intellectual property theft or co-option or coercion. And then there is the sort of reciprocal market access challenge. And all of these themes seem to be floating around within the conversations, but I'm not sure China understands which is the priority. And I'm not sure, frankly, that the administration, on a day-to-day basis or on an hour-to-hour basis, is exactly sure what the priority is. So what we're going to do here is we're going to ask each of the panelists to focus on one area, at least initially, and then we'll try to tease out generally what the problems are. We have Derek Scissors from AEI, Bruce Andrews from Rock Creek, and Mary Lovely from Peterson. I've tried, as most geeky moderators do, to find some common thread between all of them, and I've got kind of one. Mary teaches in her, when she's not ruling the roost here at Peterson and at Syracuse University. Bruce is from Syracuse, and Derek shares the name of the first name of the best basketball player to ever come out of Syracuse. So that's about it. So let me start sort of in reverse of it. If you look at deficit questions, technology theft questions, and reciprocal market access questions, and the reform question more generally. Start with Derek. We'll go to Mary, and then have Bruce clean up.
Thanks, Charles. So I'm going to try to lay the basis, which is the Chinese side. I probably am the person on the panel who will most defend the Trump administration. That's not going to be a full-throated defense, but if you do want to get the Trump administration side, I do know what it is, as of last night. But I'd rather talk about the Chinese side, and I get to do that here. So, where is China's expression in the world coming from? All large economies, what matters most to them is what they're doing internally, not what's happening externally, even if they blame other countries for their problems. And the two main events in Chinese reform are, I will tie this to international issues, but bear with me for a second because this actually matters and no one talks about it, are the status of the state corporate sector and rural land rights, property rights to land. Both of them don't look very good. You can, especially if you focus on sectors where we've had a handful of very large private firms like Tencent, you can find a reduced state share in some of those output indicators, not the input indicators. The state still just absorbs all the inputs and inefficiently uses them. But this is balanced against the fact that even at those firms, the party is requiring greater party control and greater accountability of what are now very large private sector firms to the party. So their status as private is more compromised than it was even 5 years ago. They're certainly not state-owned enterprises. I wouldn't call them private by American standards. And the active policy on the state corporate side has been to expand the role of state-owned enterprises through mergers. So it's not good enough that you have 3 very large state-owned enterprises, you need to have 2 or 1. You're going to reduce even the semblance of competition, and the story is, this will make them more competitive on the world stage. That's not reassuring. It's not clear that they will become more competitive on the world stage. It is the case that these firms are more difficult to compete with in China than they already are, which is the market access question that Charles raised. More subtle, but crucial to China's successful development, we had at the third plenum, the most recent third plenum, a promise that we were going to converge rural and urban land rights. And in urban China, you can basically own property. The state will come and take it away from you, but you have pretty secure property rights. And in rural China, you do not. And people don't get rich without secure property rights. So when people talk about whether China's going to become rich, not by the idiotic World Bank people, GDP per capita measures, the Chinese report income less than half of GDP per capita. That's not a measurement of how prosperous you are. So if you want to become a rich country, you have to give people property rights. And 600 million Chinese don't have property rights to their most valuable asset. And until that happens, China's not going to be a rich country. So, they recognize this, they said they're going to do something, their ideological problems, they're not making progress that I can tell, although I'm not based in China. So on the 2 major areas of reform, we see problems. And how does that manifest itself? Well, I have to be very quick here because we're doing short presentations. When I look at China's, projection of Chinese growth, you're not going to get growth out of land because you won't give rural land to people to use. You're aging. You've run up an enormous amount of debt, which I would love to talk about more in the last 10 years. So you're increasingly reliant on innovation. Okay, the Chinese recognize this. That's fine. They're on the right track. The problem is when you suppress competition for the sake of the state sector, you get less innovation. Large companies that don't ever die don't have to innovate. They just copy other people's innovations when it comes along. So I see that as more motivation for the Chinese to steal, motivation for the Chinese to coerce. This is a different story than the China will create its own intellectual property and then it will protect it better. I used to believe that story. I no longer believe it. I think the incentive in the Chinese development model is to steal and coerce more, which means we're going to have more problems with them as we go along. Obviously, we can discuss that. And finally, and this is all Ken's fault because he told me to cover all these topics, and I have to try to create a link between them, which is better than Derek Coleman. On the investment side, I was asked to talk about Chinese investment strategy, and I think the key there is, if you look at some numbers, Chinese official reserves from May 2014 to May 2018 fell $840 billion. Banking system, broader banking system, foreign exchange, they're messing with that data, but it's about 1.2 trillion. It's larger. They've lost more money. The current account surplus over this period is $800 billion, so we've had $2 trillion of net capital loss. That is not flight. I am not claiming that's flight. So for those of you who follow that issue, $2 trillion of capital exit is not the same as capital flight. Nonetheless, when you're looking at that amount of money leaving your country and you are not rich, as China is not rich, your predominant investment policy is, I got to get control of that. And that's in fact what they've been doing for the past year and a half. Still China wants to buy technology, still China wants to buy land and diversify its resource allocation. They like the U.S. being a crude oil and gas supplier because it diversifies their crude oil and gas supply away from the Russians and the Middle East. So those are still factors, but the predominant factor right now is for the Chinese to control capital exit, which means we've had a resurgence of state-owned enterprise investment, a dampening of property investment, and so on. So just to reiterate, if you look at the domestic reform situation, I don't think it's successful. That means more coercion of IP because they need the innovation. It means less Chinese investment than we would get from a successful economy because they're worried about capital leaving their country. I did it, Ken.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up, I think, a little bit on Derek's theme, just in terms of, first of all, to say that I think that as a independent scholar, I agree with his assessment of the return of the state and the potential impact on China's acquisition of technology by simplified the problem in a lot of ways. But there are many ways in which China obtains technology, some of which violate international norms and some of which do, and that we need a lot more thought on exactly how that occurs and how we can productively respond to that here in the West. I want to ask a different question, which is to look at the current approach, which is punitive tariffs, and to ask whether they will be effective in bringing about desired changes in Chinese policy, and whether or not they're helpful or harmful for the United States. As Charles mentioned, talking about China trade and U.S. policy is a little bit like playing ping pong, because the objective changes in virtually mid-sentence sometimes. Sometimes we're talking about reducing the bilateral trade deficit. Sometimes we're talking about the actual content of the Section 232, which is enforced tech transfer. And sometimes we're talking about reciprocal market access. I'm going to really be talking about just whether it will bring about the desired changes in tech transfer. Let me begin by saying that I think these are very important issues, that China does in many ways violate the norms of the global trading system, even if they do not violate specific aspects of the agreements. But I don't believe that the current set of punitive tariffs will be effective in any way in bringing about needed changes inside China. So why are these tariffs so ineffective as a tool for productive change? The idea is to use a tariff stick to force significant changes in Chinese policy that, in the words of the 301 report, will burden American commerce. So we have many people who write articles or ask the question, who will win the trade war? And how great is the pain that we can cause China with our tariffs? Many observers, indeed perhaps the president himself, believes that it's easy to win a trade war with China. And this belief is generally based on the observation that U.S. imports from China are several times China's imports from the United States. But as the U.S. expands the list of Chinese products subject to import tariffs and China responds in kind, China will allegedly run out of products to target with tariffs before the U.S. does. So the U.S. will be able to inflict more pain on China, so the logic goes, than the Chinese can impose on the United States. Now this calculation or observations are flawed on several levels. First, and perhaps most important, is the very large share of the goods that the U.S. imports from China are produced by multinational corporations, including those multinational corporations based in the United States. Using customs records, my team estimates that fully 60% of U.S. imports from China originate from foreign enterprises operating in China. These products are coming from Samsung, Foxconn, General Electric, often under explicit arrangements, processing imported inputs by Chinese workers. A good example, besides the ubiquitous example of the iPhone, is the testing and packaging of American-made computer chips. Based on the list released last week by the USTR, the revised list, the largest single category of Chinese goods targeted by the Section 301 tariffs is computers and electronic products. Our estimates, again based on analysis of China customs records, indicate that 87% of these targeted products are produced by multinationals operating in China. They do not hit domestic Chinese firms directly. The next two largest groups are also dominated by supply chain trade, which is what this is. 60% of imports originate in foreign affiliates of American or allied firms. The revised list particularly doubled down on transportation equipment, which was an important topic in the last panel, and we estimate that 65% of the transportation equipment imports that are coming from China are produced by non-Chinese multinational corporations. So one might think, who cares if the tariffs hurt Samsung as long as it hurts China and forces them to comply with our demands? The problem with this line of thinking is that China isn't hurt that much when we target foreign multinationals. Why? Because Chinese value added in these activities is low. For example, the OECD WTO project, Trade Value Added, finds that Chinese value added in computers and electronic products is relatively low, estimated at only 45%. So you're getting 45 cents on every dollar, even when you hit a sort of an average of domestic and foreign multinationals. So I hope we can get more into the importance of supply chains. Certainly another question to ask is how these supply chains benefit U.S. competitiveness. Again, this was very well articulated in the previous panel. Let me just close in the interest of time in saying these will not be effective in hurting China. We will not win a trade war. We will only hurt our own economy and fail to engage in the kind of very important and productive discussions we need to be having in China about serious violations of international norms. Thank you.
Thank you. So for better or worse, in my 5.5 years at the Commerce Department, I got to be involved in 5 JCCTs, which unfortunately you don't get any prize for that. Like maybe a little lapel pin that has a microphone in it for the Chinese government. But one of the things I will start with saying, and it will probably be the only time you will ever hear me say this, but I do give the Trump administration credit for something, which is, I do think from the very beginning, they recognized what other administrations learned more through frustration, which is that we needed to take a stronger approach with China. There is no doubt that the Chinese practices merit much more focus and attention by the U.S. And in previous administration, I'll say it's for Obama, we tried to work with them, we tried to work cooperatively, and frankly, there was a belief that they would ultimately move in the right direction and liberalize their economy, and they just didn't. The commitments that I think were part of their WTO accession, they didn't really live up to. They didn't make the reforms that they said they would. They didn't live up to the commitments. You know, the last JCCT, we did essentially a report card where we took the commitments of the previous 7 JCCTs, and let's just say they didn't get a grade that I would want my kids to get in school for their success rate. But also the reforms going in the wrong direction, and Derek made a little reference to that. But I think we all sort of had this hope that they would move in the right direction on their own. And if anything, Xi Jinping is placing a greater state control and less liberalization than previous Chinese presidents had done. Even when the previous third-party fund said they would let the market decide. So what I was asked to talk about is a little bit of the experience of negotiating and doing a bunch of JCCTs with the Chinese. And here's what I will tell you. They are very organized, they are very focused, and they are very strategic, for starters. And I will also say, and you can take, in some places, I will implicitly contrast this with where I think we are right now with this administration, and in some places you can do your own contrasting for where you think we are. But part of the challenge with the Chinese, they are very good at knowing exactly what they want to give, and they will only go as far as they are prepared to go. They come in with a very clear understanding, and they know what they want to do. And the reality is, we need to press them. We do need to push them to go further, because if we don't, they won't do it. They'll do only liberalizations and only reforms that they see as directly in their interest. And I would use financial services as an example, where they've been wanting to give that to us for a while. In the bit when Trump went to China, and to, in some ways, to the administration's credit, they didn't trade it for something. Because another problem with the Chinese negotiating with them is they always want symmetry in deliverables. So if we go in with a list of 10 items that we want, they come back with a list of 10 items that they want. If we say we have to have these 5 things, they say, well, we have to have 5 things in our system. And part of the challenge is our system's much more open. So the list of things they come with is often things that are just unreasonable or unacceptable, because frankly, we don't have that much left to give them in terms of openness and access to the U.S. market. One thing I can tell you, after hearing the talking points about 50,000 times, is they don't like our national security restrictions. That's export controls, that's CFIUS. And one of the things, and we can talk about this in the questions if people are interested, is I do think that they will, if the administration intends to leave whatever they do with an enhanced export reform or export control reforms or investment restrictions, if the U.S. government plans to put those in place for the long term, I think we'll have a very difficult time getting to a deal with the Chinese, because I think they will see the need to reciprocate, and it is unlikely at a time that we are asking them to open their economy that they will be willing to do that if they feel that the U.S. government is placing additional, particularly China-focused restrictions in place. One of the problems is it used to be that we were very good at using the global trading system to our advantage and understanding the WTO rules. The reality is they're getting better at playing the game, and they're getting better at utilizing the tools that exist. At the same time, the United States is walking away. And the idea of seeing Xi Jinping on the stage at Davos claiming to be the protector of the global trading system is kind of laughable, but unfortunately, they're seizing the high ground right now and trying to take that. As I mentioned before, they're not always good at living up to their commitments. And whether it's because they slow walk them, whether they just decide to not do it, or there's so many levels that their government that getting change. But they use that to an effect, but they have to be held accountable. And that's one of the reasons that as the administration approaches this process with the Chinese, one of the things I don't get is what is our end game in terms of what we want? What is the vehicle going to be that we are going to memorialize their commitments and then hold them to them? For when we had the BIT negotiations going on, it was actually going to have a dispute mechanism that could be useful in a way to hold them accountable what they're saying. Doesn't seem like we're headed towards that, or at least I don't get the sense the administration has a real strategy on how to get there. Another thing about the negotiating with the Chinese, they want everything to be negotiable. They want our export control rules. They want CFIUS. They want North Korea and trade. They see national security and economic security is all part of one big game that you can sit at the table and trade things. And one of the things that the United States had always done, at least until this administration, is separated national security from economic security, because if we start saying that national security processes and tools can either be used for protectionist measures, or we're not using them in a legitimate way that respects the integrity of our own law and process, then frankly we're conceding something to them that justifies a whole host of restrictions that they use because they see no distinction between national security and economic security. They have a plan, and that was one of the challenges that we're particularly seeing now. First, it was their indigenous innovation, and now it's made in China 2025. I have challenged people, but I cannot find a single person who can tell me what anything remotely comparable we, the United States, are doing other than trying to stop their plan that will make us competitive or more competitive in the global marketplace. One of the points, and I think Mary's comments got to this, but it presents a real challenge in negotiating with them. They can absorb a lot more pain than we can, particularly now that Xi Jinping has consolidated power. If we had actually, in the first part of the Trump administration, gone after them before Xi had consolidated power, I actually think we would have caught them at a moment of much greater vulnerability. Instead, we spent a year, now a year and a half, almost 2 years, kind of what I would describe as wasting time on NAFTA rather than really focusing on which had been our top priority. But now that Xi has done this, he can absorb a lot of pain. And frankly, he can get the Chinese people to absorb a lot of pain in the name of nationalism and fighting the barbarians who are, imposing this stuff on them. The other thing is, and this is a real contrast to the United States, they are unified, and their business community will absolutely support anything the government tells them to do. The reality is, they can tell the people what to do, and they've got unity. Here, we neither have a Congress that is bought into how the administration is approaching it, and we have a business community that is very concerned. So there's no consensus, which makes us weaker in the negotiation, significantly weakens the administration's hands. Another thing they do in negotiations they're very good at is exploiting gaps between us and our allies. They will play the United States off against our allies, whether that's granting favorable conditions and terms to one, while taking away from another. But that is one of the reasons that a multilateral approach would have been so important, of working with the Europeans, working with the Japanese, the Koreans, the Australians,